bread and beer, cheese, butter, buttermilk, onions and garlic, millet and barley, or things that ancient people ate. Welcome to today's episode. Hello everyone and welcome to Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history and world building. In today's episode we'll be talking about ancient food. This is going to be a two-parter as there's a lot to cover and I want to give you as much detail as I possibly can, without being boring. Before we begin, let us talk about the miniature. This is Hesta, the Abyssinian wizard from Animal Adventures Tales of Cats and Catacombs. And with that out of the way, let us begin. In my opinion, there's a lot of misconception going around regarding ancient foods. People either believe that ancient people ate only bread and meat, others believe that they ate only roots and bread and everything was tasteless and shapeless and flavorless. That's far from the truth. Although you have to understand that up until the 1950s, refrigerators were not a common thing. Actually, ice boxes and refrigerators came to be beginning with the 19th century, so the 1800s. Up until then, people had to be inventive with their food. That's why people started smoking meat, started curing meat, and started turning raw milk, which spoils really fast, into dairy products such as cheeses, butter, buttermilk, yogurt, and everything else in between. When it comes to bread, people didn't have wheat bread as we have today. Wheat was not a big thing in ancient times, as the wheat we now have is a result of very rigorous cross-pollinating throughout centuries. As such, bread was mostly made of barley or millet, which is nowadays used as animal fodder, but in ancient times it was very prevalent. Beer was also a very important staple of ancient diets, as it was a varied way of bringing more nutrients into the body, and it was a way to use spoiled, moldy grain. Although not always using fresh grains for making beer, having such an important part in ancient society had to be regulated. As such, the first law passed to regulate beer was applied in 1700 BCE, so almost 3700 years ago, in the Hammurabi Code. And there it is mentioned that if a brewer sold beer that was not up to standard or didn't have a reasonable price, that brewer would be thrown into water, so basically drowned. Vegetables. They ate a lot of vegetables, mostly carrots, turnips, radish, cabbage, but we find other things such as celery and lettuce. Pulse. Peas, broad beans, lentils, chickpeas, soybeans. People heavily relied on them. Nuts were also a very important source of nutrients. Almonds, walnuts, chestnuts, and the such. Herbs and spices. Throughout history, from ancient times and nowadays, people like flavor-packed food. As such, in ancient times, people went at great lengths to make sure they had spices and herbs to enhance the flavor of their dishes. We're gonna be talking about spices in a different video, as it is a very interesting and important subject that I want to detail for you. Fruit. Throughout history, people enjoyed fruit. Of course, they tended to lean more on fruit that had a longer shelf life, that could be stored for longer and were fresh for longer, such as apples, pears and quince. But because fruit are seasonal, people try to take advantage of as many fruit as possible and make sure they had access to them, importing them and trying to cultivate them locally. Because sugar was not yet discovered in ancient times, people used a lot of honey to sweeten their desserts and dishes in general. And with that, before we continue our travels through culinary history, let's take a peek at the miniature, see how it's coming along. After using Agrac's Earth Shade to darken the brown fur on Hesta's face, I am now focusing once again on the face itself, going back and forth between Flayed One Flesh and a combination of Mournfang Brown and Troll Slayer until I'm happy with the results, and even then I might come back to the face as I add more and more details to the miniature. Now I am using Baraknar Burundy to darken the inside of the hood, as I feel it complements both Hesta's fur and the robe she is wearing, so that the brighter details stand out a little bit more. Everland Sunset is used for the eyes alongside Moot Green, and a combination of the two is used to paint the irises of Hesta's eyes, at least one of them, as the other one is a little bit milky, following an arcane accident. And then a combination of Katachan Flesh and Abaddon Black to paint in the pupil. Let us continue. Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia as a whole region is in the heart of the Middle East. I'm not gonna talk about Babylonians and Assyrians separately, but I'm gonna talk about the region as a whole, because although there are of course differences between what people prefer and what they have access to, or the moment in history you are talking about, there are certain elements that are common to this region and can be dated back from the Assyrians, Akkadians and Babylonians. Beer and bread. These two constitute the cornerstone of the Mesopotamian diet throughout hundreds if not thousands of years. As I've mentioned a little while ago, they enacted laws that protected and regulated beer production. This is quite an interesting aspect, and it shows how important beer was for that ancient society. When it comes to other foodstuff, they relied on barley, they relied on chickpeas, lentils and peas, and when it comes to meat, they ate a lot of fish, they ate poultry, geese, duck, swans, the such, and horse meat. I know that sounds strange for us nowadays, but it's not that strange, and there are many modern cultures that still eat horse meat. And with that, although it's not much to go on, the fact that they enacted laws to protect beer is interesting enough that they got on my list. Now let's move on to Northern Africa, ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians liked their bread sweetened with dates, figs and or honey. They had date and fig beer. The workers that built the pyramids were also paid in a daily quantity of beer. So again, it was quite important. When it comes to fish, they had a lot of sacred fish, so they didn't have a very wide variety that they could eat. And because fish was still an important part of their diet, the curing of fish was relegated to temple officials. So again, we have some laws that talk about how fish could and should be consumed. When it comes to other kinds of meat, beef was not on the table that often. It was quite expensive, and you wouldn't want to kill something that sustained you over several years. They would consume beef only during religious ceremonies or important celebrations. But they did eat a lot of poultry. Duck, geese, swans, ostrich, and interestingly enough, they ate foie gras. If somebody thinks that foie gras was invented in modern times, you are mistaken. The technique of cramming food down the throat of ducks and geese has been around from 2500 BCE, so for more than 4500 years. It's not something new. They ate foie gras, they ate sweetened bread, they had date beer, Another thing that sets them apart in my opinion is that they really liked onions and garlic. They liked them so much that they are quite often mentioned in texts, which is quite amusing in my opinion. When it comes to fruit, date, figs, sugar cane, but that comes into play a little bit later, and the wealthy were able to afford importing coconuts. Before we continue, let's just stop for a bit and look at the miniature. Using Carroburg Crimson, I am deepening the shadows on the hood, both on the inside and the outside, as I believe it complements the corn red, the Mephiston red and the burgundy used both on the hood and the robe. As you can see, it makes everything pop a little bit more. Now going back to Flayed One Flesh, I am touching up the face as I mess it up while painting the hood. Going to the combination of Catachan Flesh and Abaddon Black, I am now working on the leather elements of the miniature, making sure that I hit every strap, every bit of visible leather. Now going to Caliban Green, I am using it to paint Hesta's spellbook, trying not to mess up the hood and the robe. And going to Rakarth Flesh, I am painting the pages of the book. Then going back to Caliban Green, I am repairing some mistakes that I just made. Ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks bring something interesting to the table. Although I'm sure there were subtle differences between the diet of different city-states, they shared most of their culinary tradition. First and foremost, they had 3 clearly established meals a day, with the most important being dinner. For breakfast, they usually had bread dipped in wine. Perhaps they did this because they liked wine, and because their bread, being made out of barley or millet, was quite dense, quite hard, quite heavy, and dipping it into wine made it a little bit more flavorful and easier to eat. They also had a pancake made out of wheat flour that's been mentioned starting around 500 BCE. So as you can see, the closer we get to our modern time, the more common wheat becomes. They ate this pancake with olives and cheese, drizzled with a little bit of honey. So that sounds really tasty to me. Although they had cheeses and other dairy products, they didn't really like butter. They mention butter when talking about the Thracians and the Illyrians, 2 neighboring people to the north and northwest, and the Greeks called them butter eaters. Now, I don't know if this was supposed to be a slur, but apparently it was used to describe their neighbors. They really liked their desserts and combining sweet with savory, as they combined cheese and olives and fruit, everything drizzled in honey. And they also drank a very interesting concoction. It was called Kikion. Kikion is a... Hey y'all, sorry for the interruption, this is Modern Day Sherban and I'm here to give a special shout out to Max Miller and his YouTube channel Tasting History for having one of the best and among the few representations of Kikion out there. Believe me, I've scoured the internet for quite a bit and still haven't found a better image and a better representation for the ancient cocktail. As such, please go and check out his channel, I'm sure you're gonna love it. Cocktail made with wine, barley meal, grated goat cheese, a few spices, and sweetened with honey. It sounds really funky, but to be honest, I think I'd try it. I think I'm gonna actually make it. Just out of curiosity. I'm sure it really depends on the wine you're using or the cheese you're using, but I'm curious. They seem to enjoy it. And with that, let's peek at the miniature before we wrap things up. And now for Hesta's Familiar. I'm using Moot Green as I am painting the body, And then Everland Sunset, Aerial Yellow and Fleshgit Yellow as I'm painting the front side and the head of the familiar. My inspiration was the double yellow-headed Amazon parrot, but with more yellow as it is magical. And now, using Stormhost Silver, I am touching up the runes and magical chains that embellish Hesta's robe, trying not to cover the emerald effect that I managed to obtain. And now, wiping most of the paint off on a paper towel, I am using what's left to dry brush and make sure I get all of the raised details. Now going back to Mournfang Brown, I am touching up the leather elements of the gear. Before we end today's episode, I want to talk about spices. The Greeks used pepper. They knew the difference between long pepper and peppercorns, as they were both brought from India after Alexander the Great's campaigns there. They knew the difference between Ceylon, cinnamon and cassia, and they used a lot of herbs and spices, dill seeds, fennel, anise, pepper and so on, to enhance the flavor of their foods. And with that, we're done with part 1 of ancient foods. Next episode will continue this journey through culinary history. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you got some inspiration or at least learned something new today. Please like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, leave a comment, and I'll see you all here next time on Funky Monkey MP. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.